The road leading out of town was darker than Sarah remembered. The stars above were veiled by thick, rolling clouds, and the moonlight barely broke through. Her car headlights cut through the blackness, illuminating the narrow, winding road ahead. The doll sat in the passenger seat, silent but still exuding its oppressive presence. Every so often, Sarah's eyes darted to it, half expecting it to move or change expression. But it remained eerily still, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. As she drove, the sense of unease that had lingered since leaving the antique shop began to grow. The hum from the doll had stopped, but the air inside the car felt heavy, as though the atmosphere itself was pressing down on her. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Every curve in the road felt sharper, every shadow more menacing. She glanced at the photograph Thomas had given her, now tucked into the dashboard. Lily's smiling face stared back at her, a stark contrast to the haunting energy that surrounded the doll. Sarah whispered under her breath, "I'm doing this for you, Lily. We're going to fix this." The miles stretched on, and the road seemed longer than it should have been. Sarah checked the clock on the dashboard, 2:13 a.m. She'd left the shop over an hour ago, but the drive back to the creek should have taken no more than 30 minutes. She frowned, her stomach twisting with unease. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a soft rustling from the back seat. Sarah's grip on the wheel tightened, and her heart began to pound. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. The memory of the shadowy figure she'd seen earlier flashed in her mind, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a faint, childlike giggle. It was soft and distant, as though carried on the wind, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from inside the car. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Lily," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response, but the giggle came again, closer this time. Slowly, Sarah glanced at the rearview mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. Sitting in the back seat, just behind the doll, was a small figure. Its outline was faint, like a shadow given form, and its head was tilted to one side, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Lily," Sarah said again, louder this time. The figure didn't move, but the giggle faded into silence. Sarah forced herself to focus on the road, her mind racing. She couldn't stop now. She had to reach the creek. When Sarah finally reached the turnoff for the creek, the road had narrowed into a dirt path, overgrown with weeds and flanked by towering trees. The car's tires crunched over the gravel as she slowed to a crawl, the headlights casting long, flickering shadows into the forest. The creek was just ahead, but the path was blocked by a fallen tree. Sarah sighed, gripping the wheel tightly. There was no choice but to continue on foot. She grabbed the doll and flashlight from the passenger seat, hesitating for a moment as she glanced back at the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Stepping out of the car, Sarah was immediately struck by the silence. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, no distant chirping of crickets, just a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow all sound. The air was cold, biting at her skin as she made her way toward the creek. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow trail ahead. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming grotesque shapes in the dim light. Shadows danced and shifted at the edges of her vision, but every time she turned her head, there was nothing there. When Sarah reached the creek, it looked exactly as it had in her vision, calm and still, reflecting the faint light of the moon above. The air here felt different, thicker, as if the creek itself were alive and watching her. She stepped closer, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The doll in her arms began to hum again, a low, steady vibration that resonated through her body. Sarah knelt by the water's edge, her reflection staring back at her in the still surface. But it wasn't alone. Standing behind her reflection was Lily, her translucent form barely visible in the moonlight. Sarah turned slowly, her heart racing. Lily stood a few feet away, her small frame shimmering like a mirage. Her expression was somber, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to pierce straight through Sarah's soul. "Lily," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm here to help you. Tell me what to do." Lily raised a hand and pointed toward the center of the creek. The water rippled, and something began to emerge. A shape, dark and indistinct, rising slowly from the depths. Sarah's breath hitched as the object broke the surface, revealing itself to be an old, rusted locket. It floated toward her, carried by an unseen force, and landed gently at her feet. Sarah picked up the locket, her fingers trembling. She opened it to find a small photograph of Lily and a man she recognized as Thomas. But behind their smiling faces was another figure, partially obscured. A man with cold, dark eyes and a sinister grin. Sarah's stomach turned as she realized who it was, their father. Before Sarah could process what she was seeing, the air around her shifted. The calm surface of the creek began to ripple violently, and the shadows of the trees stretched and twisted unnaturally. A low, guttural growl echoed through the forest, sending shivers down Sarah's spine. Lily's form flickered like a dying flame, her expression shifting from sadness to fear. She pointed again, this time at the doll in Sarah's hands. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as the doll seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Sarah clutched the locket tightly, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than she could have imagined. Lily's death wasn't an accident. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a deliberate act of malice, buried and forgotten by time. As the growl grew louder, Sarah realized she wasn't alone. The shadows around her began to move, coalescing into a dark, menacing form. The air grew colder, and a voice, deep and distorted, echoed through the clearing. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah's grip on the doll tightened, her pulse pounding in her ears. She took a step back, her mind screaming for her to run, but her feet refused to move. The shadowy figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "Leave," the voice growled, "or you'll join her." The shadow moved closer, its form becoming more defined with each step. Sarah could see it now. A tall, distorted figure with impossibly long limbs and hollow eyes that seemed to pull the light from the air around them. Its presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. A piece of a nightmare made flesh. Sarah's legs trembled, but she stood her ground, clutching the doll and the locket as though they were shields. She forced herself to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" The shadow didn't answer right away. Instead, it stopped at the edge of the creek, the water around it boiling and churning violently. When it spoke, its voice was a low, guttural growl that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. "You've meddled in what you don't understand. She is mine. Leave her be." Sarah's grip on the doll tightened, the hum now vibrating through her entire body. "She's not yours," Sarah shot back, her voice stronger now. "She's a child. She didn't deserve this." The shadow let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a snarl. "You think you know her story? You think you can save her?" It took another step forward, the darkness around it spreading like ink in water. "She called to you, but not for freedom. She called for vengeance." Sarah froze, the weight of those words sinking in. Vengeance? Her mind raced as she glanced at Lily's ghostly form, still flickering faintly by the water's edge. The little girl's expression was unreadable now, her eyes locked on Sarah's. The air grew colder, each breath Sarah took turning into a visible puff of vapor. The doll in her hands pulsed again, and for a brief moment, she felt a surge of energy, like Lily's presence was urging her forward. "You don't control her anymore," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She stepped closer to the creek, holding the doll out in front of her like a weapon. "Whatever you did to her, it ends now." The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering as though Sarah's words had struck a nerve. But it quickly recovered, letting out a guttural growl that echoed through the forest. "You think you're a savior? You're just another fool drawn into her web." Before Sarah could react, the shadow lunged forward, its elongated arms stretching out toward her. She stumbled back, narrowly avoiding its grasp, and felt the icy chill of its presence brush against her skin. Her heart pounded as she realized she couldn't outrun it. Not here, not now. With no other choice, Sarah turned to the creek. The locket in her hand glinted in the faint moonlight, and an idea began to form. If Lily's spirit was tied to the doll, perhaps the locket, the last piece of her story, was the key to breaking the shadow's hold on her. Kneeling by the water's edge, Sarah opened the locket and placed it beside the doll. The shadow let out a deafening roar, its form shifting wildly as though it were in pain. "Stop!" it bellowed, its voice shaking the ground beneath her. "You don't know what you're doing." Ignoring the warning, Sarah plunged her hands into the freezing water, holding both the doll and the locket beneath the surface. The moment they touched the water, the hum from the doll intensified, growing into a piercing, high-pitched sound that made Sarah wince. The creek began to glow faintly, the water swirling around her hands in intricate patterns. Lily's ghostly form appeared beside her, more solid now, her eyes locked on the shadow. For the first time, Sarah saw a spark of determination in the little girl's gaze. Lily raised a hand, pointing at the shadow, and the air around them seemed to vibrate with an unseen force. The shadow let out another roar, its form growing larger as it tried to lash out at Sarah. But an invisible barrier stopped it, the force of Lily's will holding it back. "You can't stop me," the shadow snarled, its voice laced with desperation. "She's mine." "No," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. She turned to Lily, her eyes pleading. "It's your choice, Lily. Do you want to stay, or do you want to be free?" For a moment, everything went still. The water stopped swirling, the air grew quiet, and even the shadow froze in place. Lily stepped closer to Sarah, her translucent form shimmering in the faint light. She knelt beside Sarah, her small hands resting on the doll and the locket. A single tear rolled down Lily's cheek as she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was soft but clear, carrying a weight that seemed to echo through the clearing. With a small nod, she closed her eyes and pressed her hands against the doll. The glow from the creek intensified, bathing the entire area in a blinding light. Sarah shielded her eyes, feeling the warmth of the light wash over her. The shadow let out one final, anguished scream before it dissolved into nothingness, its form scattering like smoke in the wind. When the light faded, Sarah opened her eyes to find the creek calm once more. The doll lay still in her hands, its hum completely gone. Lily's form was nowhere to be seen, but the air around her felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Sarah sat by the creek for what felt like hours, her mind racing to process everything that had happened. The locket in her hand felt warm, and when she opened it again, she saw that Lily's photograph had changed. The little girl was smiling now, her eyes filled with a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. With a deep breath, Sarah stood and made her way back to the car. The forest felt different now, less menacing, more serene. She placed the doll and the locket on the passenger seat and started the engine, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. As she drove away from the creek, she couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror. This time, there was no shadowy figure, no ghostly presence, just the reflection of a woman who had faced her fears and done what she could to right a terrible wrong. But as the town disappeared in the distance and the open road stretched before her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. The past had a way of clinging to those who dared to unearth it, and she wondered if Lily's story was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. For now, though, the night was quiet, and Sarah allowed herself a small, tired smile. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The drive home felt longer than usual, the road stretching endlessly under the pale glow of her headlights. The silence in the car was almost deafening, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the doll shifting slightly on the passenger seat. Sarah's thoughts were a whirlwind, her mind replaying every moment by the creek, every word the shadow had uttered, and every glance from Lily's sorrowful eyes. The locket in her pocket felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of everything she had just endured. She hadn't dared to open it again since leaving the creek, afraid of what she might see. Was Lily truly at peace now, or was there still more to uncover? The questions hung in the air like an unfinished symphony, their answers just out of reach. When Sarah pulled into her driveway, The familiar sight of her modest home should have brought her comfort. But tonight, it felt different. The porch light flickered slightly as she approached the front door, a small detail that would have gone unnoticed any other day. She shook her head, chalking it up to her frazzled nerves. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. Lucas was fast asleep upstairs, his favorite blanket still crumpled on the couch from their earlier movie night. Sarah paused, her eyes lingering on the blanket. For a brief moment, she envied her son's innocence, his ability to sleep soundly without the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. Setting the doll and locket on the kitchen counter, Sarah poured herself a glass of water. Her hands trembled slightly as she drank, the cool liquid doing little to calm her racing heart. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her, even in the safety of her own home. Later that night, Sarah found herself sitting on the edge of Lucas's bed, watching him sleep. His soft, even breaths were a reminder of the life she had fought so hard to protect. But as she brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that Lily's story wasn't the only one tied to that doll. The locket rested in her palm, its once warm surface now cold to the touch. She opened it hesitantly, her breath catching in her throat. Lily's photo was still there, but the smile that had brought Sarah a fleeting sense of peace was now replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible shadow behind her. It was subtle, so easy to miss, but Sarah knew better than to dismiss it as a trick of the light. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ticking clock on the wall. There was no answer, of course, but as she closed the locket and placed it on Lucas's nightstand, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just invited something into her home. Whether it was Lily's lingering presence or something far darker, Sarah didn't know. All she knew was that her life would never be the same. The next morning, Sarah decided to pay a visit to the antique shop. She needed answers about the doll, about Lily, about the shadow that had haunted her. The shop felt different now, its once inviting atmosphere replaced by a sense of foreboding. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the older man behind the counter looked up with a mix of surprise and concern. "You're back," he said, his voice carrying a hint of apprehension. Sarah placed the doll and locket on the counter, her eyes locked on his. "I need to know the truth," she said firmly. "About this. About her." The man's expression darkened, and he let out a heavy sigh. "I was hoping you wouldn't come back," he admitted. "Some stories are better left buried." Sarah's patience wore thin. "Well, I don't have that luxury. This isn't just a story for me. It's my life now. And if there's something I need to know, you owe it to me to tell me." The man hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. He gestured for Sarah to follow him to the back of the shop, where a small, cluttered office awaited. On the walls were faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, each one telling a fragment of a story Sarah had yet to piece together. "This isn't just about Lily," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "She's part of something bigger, something older. That doll has passed through more hands than you can imagine, and every time, it leaves something behind. Memories, shadows, echoes of the lives it touches." Sarah's stomach churned. "And the shadow? What was that?" The man's eyes narrowed. "That's the thing you don't want to name. It feeds on pain, on guilt, on regret. It attaches itself to the doll and uses it as a vessel. Lily's story may have drawn you in, but the shadow, it's the one pulling the strings." As Sarah left the shop, the man's final words echoed in her mind. "You have a choice," he had said. "You can destroy the doll, end its cycle, but there's no guarantee it will release you. Or you can keep it, learn to live with it, and hope it doesn't take more than it already has." Neither option felt right. As Sarah drove home, the locket and doll sitting silently beside her, she realized that her fight wasn't over. The shadow might have been vanquished, but its mark remained, and it would take more than courage to reclaim her life.